Put the invoice on. Is it unethical for me to set up a tip jar? I just checked. I know you should have one in your office.
Right. Okay, do we need to have the screen to show the contract if we sent it out and they have it?
I don't think so.
No, I think you're good. So,
Just have the people, they've got the stuff that we've sent them and
Yep.
then they can ask questions. And
yep, and it was sent out, so everybody should have a copy.
should- good.
Okay, here's your speaker, and you're live.
Wondrous. Hello, 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 hello. Okay, we're good.
Do you want
Okay.
to see their faces?
I would, yeah, I'd like to see.
And I'm gonna leave the chat up just in case.
Good, good,
Okay.
okay.
You're good?
And I'll semi-pay attention to that. Thank you, Lori. Appreciate it. Oh my gosh, we're late, 1:33. Thank you for being here. Hi, Pierce.
Hi, Bob.
Hi, Cindy.
Hi.
How are you? Cindy's already warned me that as soon as it gets boring, she's leaving. What did you say? Something about you had a more important meeting that you were going to go to? See, like you guys, more important. Yeah. You know, I try not to take that personally, but I do. That's just how that is. And no, okay. And hello to all our fine Zoom persons that we see here. And you should have received all the materials. And so you have all that as we work through. What you don't have, Zoom persons, is an outline that I have in the back there for everybody. Kind of talks about what we're going to talk about, but it's just the same thing that was in the email about that we sent out about the class, about the things that we're going to talk about as we work through that and deal with that. So we've got a significant number of things. Some things that we have discussed, and it's probably an understatement, we've discussed a number of times before. And the reality is, because people are different, the market's different, the market's shifting, the market's changing, things keep happening, things keep coming up that cause us to have questions about how things work and some things are added. And the first thing is the appraisal addendum, which is the TREC addendum where the buyer has a right to terminate based on their lender's appraisal. And what we've had some challenges with, and we need to remember, this only addresses one thing. What is that? Pardon me? Not lender's approval. The appraisal, a lender's appraisal, that's it. And the buyer's right to terminate is changed in the first two choices. They waive, and they have an additional right to terminate in the third choice on the addendum, which you have in your package there. But it only relates to the appraisal, not any of the other lender underwriting requirements, such as insurability, such as lender required repairs, such as title issues, nothing else, only the appraisal. So we could have a fine appraisal issue. Buyer says, well, it didn't appraise, and seller says, well, too bad. And then the buyer says, yeah, but you know what? We've also got a lender required repair issue or a title issue or whatever else. And buyer has a right to terminate under that. Now we're going to look at under the third party financing and some of the timelines there, but we need to really keep in mind that this is very specific. Only the buyer's lender's appraisal, and it's only the buyer's lender appraisal. You know, it talks about here and deals with this. It's not anybody else's. It's not the seller's appraisal. It's doing the lender's appraisal. It's the buyer's lender. Now, we're clear because it says so on the form. And because it says so on the form, Marcia keeps getting the calls. I keep getting the calls. Our legal hotline gets the calls. And I say, you know, let's look at the addendum one more time. You can't use it for FHA or VA because FHA and VA don't allow that waiver. You know, they require it. Now, that creates a little bit of a challenge. And you see on the outline, the second thing that we talk about there. Buyers who want to do FHA, VA may feel like that their offer is at a significant disadvantage if they don't address the appraisal. And it likely is. Although there are other issues with FHA and VA that sellers use to not accept those offers. So what we're doing is we're having attorney prepared language. We're having the buyer put attorney prepared language in special provisions of the offer, waiving the appraisal contingency. Now, this has been going on. The attorneys that we deal with in the marketplace have been doing this for almost 2 years now, because we've been dealing with it that long and we've had the addendum for that period of time. And it's really accelerated in the last couple of months. And what the attorneys are very careful in saying, and what we're going to have to do to our buyer or seller, depending on who we have in this, is help them understand. Because in the 2 years that this has really been going on a regular basis, we've not had the test case. In Texas, we've not had any litigation addressing the issue of the conflict between the statement and special provisions and the FHA VA rules. The feeling of most attorneys is if it comes down to the property does not appraise, particularly if it's a VA, but even with FHA, and the buyer wants out of the deal, probably the FHA VA rules will prevail. We don't know because they don't have any litigation on it. So we need for our seller to understand, here's the risk. You know, we're glad the buyer's doing this. We're going to trust the buyer to do it. But if push comes to shove and at the end the buyer wants out of the deal and it's because of the appraisal, our feeling is that FHA and VA, whichever kind of financing it is, may support the buyer / borrower and let them terminate the contract. Now, the risk to the buyer when they put that in special provisions, and it's why we're having an attorney do it and have a good attorney advise them, the seller may sue the buyer. Whoa, you made certain promises. You intended all along to take advantage of the rules of FHA and VA, and you were just pulling my chain and we're going to sue you. So there's a risk. So far in the last 2 years, the risk hasn't happened. We don't have any litigation on it. We're pretty clear as this has accelerated dramatically. We only saw a few of them occasionally. Now we're seeing a much higher percentage of these include this. The only thing that's really kept it from being a huge problem is most FHA VA offers aren't accepted. And so we're not ending up in a contract with FHA and VA financing. It's interesting, the type of financing that we're seeing accepted of those two is VA over FHA if the seller wants to support the troops. You know, the buyer makes sure, sends them the letter and say, you know, I'm done out tonight. So you know what, I want to support the troops. And this is a really good offer. And I understand there's some challenges with VA offers and contracts, and there are, but so says, yeah, I want to do it. The other little question that a seller often has, this buyer who's doing FHA or VA financing, especially VA financing with 100% financing, if the buyer says, well, yeah, we'll cover the appraisal gap, we'll waive that, or if it turns out less than, we'll cover the amount. Really? Do they have the money to do that? If they got that kind of money, why are they going FHA or VA? Well, they just go ahead and do a 10 or 15 or 20% down conventional. And so that's a question that a seller would often say, hey, explain this to me. Why are you doing this? How does this work? And go through that process. No question, FHA and VA offers are harder to get into a contract. But certainly if that's what the buyer wants to do, or in some cases what the buyer has to do, then that's what you do. You go through that process and do it. What is your experience? What are you guys seeing on your FHA and VA? Are you experiencing that? Are you guys having buyers who are doing that? And what do you find happening and going through that? Any experiences? Margie, have you had?
All conventional.
All conventional? Yeah. Okay.
This is Darby. I'm on the
Is that because they got
line.
the money? Question?
No, this is Darby. I'm on the line. I had a seller actually accept a VA offer, but it wasn't a zero down payment. And that to them was comforting because they did see the reserves to cover in the event of a gap.
Good.
I mean,
And so it wasn't an appraisal issue, you think?
We haven't done the appraisal yet, but
Okay.
I went over all the things with my sellers, and part of the buyer's agent's intention when she presented the offer was they intentionally added in a down payment, even though they're not required to have one, to show the capability to cover gaps.
Okay, and that's good. Marjorie?
that would be our job as a buyer's agent to impress upon the seller that the buyer can perform. So,
And part of that is the buyer's lender
yeah.
calling the listing agent and talking to them. Yeah. And the buyer needs to be prepared that the chances are very high that it won't appraise on VA. Because the VA appraisal system is not really good. They have appraisers who come in from out of area, from all over the place, who are not familiar with what's going on. In the effort to protect the veteran, VA is actually hurting the veteran. They need to really fix their appraisal system. So if I got a transaction and it comes in low in appraisal, chances are really good it's VA. Because it is, so the buyer just needs to be prepared for that, as does the seller going through that. So working through it.
And in Texas, I think there's less than 150 VA approved appraisers in the entire state.
For the whole state, 150. Those are busy guys, aren't they? Except not a lot of VA offers get accepted. So,
And that's why they're coming in from other areas.
yeah, because because don't have enough all over. And they need to work on that. It's not that there aren't appraisers who are happy to become a VA appraiser, but I don't know what the requirements are, if it's tougher or harder or whatever. Is it
And it costs the appraiser more money.
to be a VA appraiser? Okay, yeah. Well, I could discourage that. I tell you, in this world today, as hard as it is for us, I'd hate to be an appraiser. I mean, golly, the stuff they're having to deal with and go through is just, gosh, awful. Just going through that challenge. So on the appraisal addendum, can't use it for FHA or VA. We just talked about if your buyer is determined they want to do FHA or they want to do VA and they want to, do a waiver on the appraisal and have a clause put in. Several of the attorneys we deal with are willing to do that, but they warn them. They say, you know what? We don't know if it'll work or not. I mean, and we don't really, they just need to understand. We need to send an email to the buyer. If you've got seller says, you know what? I know this is what they're promising, but if that's what ends up happening, could happen, could not, we don't know. And we really, truly don't. And all the attorneys who say, yeah, we haven't had the test case. We don't know. We don't know what'll happen. And the reality is, once we have a test case, unless it moves to the appellate level, there won't even be a precedent. And so we don't even know how that'll help us to work through it. So, because nothing gets published till it gets to the appellate level. So, you don't know what's going to happen when you work through that. Any questions on that as we work through it? But I know we've talked about it a number of times. And it's one of those things that I know we're in a hurry and we're popping and we're going and we're rush. And we don't always take the time to read the form. And I know this happens because, you're a good listing agent and you get an offer from a buyer's agent who's not on top of it, and then they'll send it over with this. Like they're really improving the offer, and they're not, because it's on an FHA or VA deal. They haven't read the form. So we just kind of have to work through that. Questions on this? Yes, sir.
I mean, so in summary, are you saying that this form really doesn't have any standing?
What do you mean by it doesn't have any standing?
Well,
If it's used on a conventional loan, I mean, it
conventional, yes. but-
can't be used on FHA or VA. It just simply cannot be used. It's prohibited from being used. And it says so at the very top,
Okay.
does not involve FHA insured or VA guaranteed. So this cannot be used for FHA and VA. It's not a matter of standing, it's prohibited. Can't use it. So don't let your seller into a contract with this addendum. If you're the buyer's agent, don't send an offer over with this addendum for FHA and VA. Don't do it. Prohibited. Can't do it. And I don't care if a lender says, oh yeah, we do it all the time. It's okay. Well, get another lender. It's just can't do it. Nick?
I also want to point out, this is the appraisal, there's the value It has nothing to do with property approval. So if the property is not approved for repairs or whatever, then like this doesn't mean a hill of beans, even if number one is selected,
What do you mean, doesn't mean, it means a hill of beans.
right?
Here's what it does, though. It takes away the buyer's right to terminate if it doesn't appraise. If all the other lender underwriting requirements are met and the lender loves the property and everything is great, it just didn't appraise. I said, well, it didn't appraise. And sales says, well, you waive that. You don't get to terminate because it didn't appraise. That's the only thing the buyer gets terminated based on. All the rest of it, not on this. So you're exactly right. Yep. Absolutely. So we good with this? And remember, the third choice here is not a waiver of rights. It's an additional right to terminate. And the whole purpose of the third choice here is it keeps the buyer in control regardless of what the lender wants to do. And in a high down payment situation, the buyer may check the third choice saying, you know, if it doesn't appraise for the sales price, but the loan to value is still there and the lender wants to do the deal, this gives me, the buyer / borrower, the ability to terminate contract. Now, here's the little risk. Listen, you won't understand this addendum with the third box checked. What are you doing? What? Because you could, you could check the first box and the third box. Can you? That was a trick question. Okay, now, why do you think that language is there? Check one box only. You know where that came from?
They're trying to do multiple.
Well, they are. But the lawyers on the broker lawyer committee, every time you see check one box only and anywhere in a contract, it's good. And when I served on the committee and the attorneys kind of smiled when they said this, Bob, we know you're a broker. You're a good broker, been around a long time, but you know what? Most brokers are not very bright. And we have to give them instructions and tell them check only one box because they don't know better. So, and that's why it's always there as you work through it. Because on one case, you're waiving, and on the other case, you're getting additional right. Well, you can do both. And so you got to work through that. But if you didn't have to waive, but what the buyer says, I want to be in control with the lender. If it doesn't appraise for this, I want to be able to terminate. Buyer, certainly this keeps him in control, but most listing agents aren't going to understand what the buyer's doing. And it may cloud the offer, especially if you're in a multiple offer. And the listing agent says, oh man, I don't know why they're doing number three. And he won't be bright enough to say, well, we're not willing to do that. Let's counter and take it out. So you cloud the offer if you do that, because most of them simply just won't understand it. You good? Okay.
Hey, Bob.
Yes, question.
Yes, this is Tim Horrenda. I have a question just about, I had an agent a couple of weeks ago tell me that based on, this has happened to him many times, where based on what's checked in the third-party financing addendum in paragraph 1A1, whatever that amount is, so that even if there is an appraisal waiver in place, a full waiver, if that appraisal comes in low and then the lender can't issue financing just based on that amount, that the buyer can still get out of the contract even with the waiver. Is that
Say that again, Tim.
Okay, so the agent that I spoke to, not with this office, he told me that he has seen multiple times where even with a full waiver, that if the lender decides that they cannot issue with the loan to value ratio, the amount listed in paragraph 1A1 of the third party financing, whatever that loan amount is, that the buyer still has the right to get out of the contract because
Okay, not based on the appraised value. That'd be wrong.
on appraisal, it's on how much they're able to get for a mortgage. And
Yeah, so this gets a little bit into the third choice on the appraisal addendum, because you may have a lender in the case where you've got a large down payment, 50% down, for example, doesn't appraise for the sales price, and the buyer wants out of the deal, but the lender says, no, we're going to still do the deal. But if the property doesn't appraise for the sales price, as you've got in 1A1, the conventional financing situation, and the lender says, we can't fund the loan because loan to value. If you look at property approval, on page 2 of the third party financing, I mean, you see the requirements for a buyer to terminate. And we're going to talk about that in just a minute because there are timelines. for conventional and for FHA-VA. When you look at that requirement, the buyer, one, has a certain timeline to terminate, and they have to have something from the lender. And if what the lender sends relates to the value of the property, buyer can't terminate on that basis if they've checked off full waiver on the appraisal addendum. They've lost that right to do that. So that agent, if you want to have them call me and we can visit about it, but what that agent is saying is not correct. When you waive that, because what you're dealing with is the requirement on 2B in the third-party financing addendum or the buyer terminating under property approval of what the buyer has to send to the seller to be able to terminate. And the example you just gave, the reason the buyer is terminating relates to value and which relates to the appraisal. We don't care about the lender's loan to value and all those. We just relate to why the buyer is terminating, because under the notice of termination of contract form that addresses that, it gets to what the buyer's lender is going to do under paragraph 2B of the third party financing addendum. So I would say, no, you can't under that basis because it's all based on the appraisal.
Okay.
Does that make semi-sense?
Yeah, no, that's what I thought. And I don't know the situation he was talking about. I just wasn't sure if that was something anyone knew.
No, you're correct. I'm glad you thought that. And if the agent wants to have his or her broker call me, I'll be happy to visit with them.
Okay.
In fact, if it's a group that we really like, we might encourage them to come to our classes because they may want to merge with us. Right? Okay. Now, in the third party financing addendum, we've had a couple of conversations recently about the buyer approval. And in buyer approval, where you've got there in paragraph 2A, and you've got a timeline in there, which the buyer's going to always get that timeline from their lender. And the shorter the timeline, the better it is for the seller, the longer, the better for the buyer. You'll occasionally see a buyer who's really not paying attention and is offering a lot of money, but they've got this buyer approval contingency all the way to closing. And, you know, that's really not good for a seller. And a good listing agent says, whoa, what are you doing there? And we'll counter with a much shorter time frame if they like everything else. But there's been some conversations recently about significantly reducing that timeline, or when you go to page 2 of the third party financing addendum, and you see right above paragraph B, where you could check a box, this contract is not subject to buyer obtaining buyer approval. Now, if you do this representing the buyer, first of all, the buyer needs to understand the risk, what they're doing here. And the buyer says, you know what, I'm financing because the rates are so low, I could pay cash if I had to. And they decide not to make a cash offer for whatever reason. So they check this off. You're going to have to, you know, and we talked about this in the buyer panel thing yesterday, that, you know, you may have a list where you send to the listing agent, say, here are the things we've done for your seller that you need to be aware of. And if the buyer does this, then sometimes the seller and the listing agent need to be reminded, hey, buyer approval, contingency gone. Now, you can't do that on FHA or VA. You can only do it on a conventional. But if you're going to do it on a conventional, you can check that box. Buyer needs to understand the risk that if something happens and their circumstances change, and they're no longer able to obtain buyer approval, if they don't close, they're going to be in default. And they need to understand that risk, and as a minimum, lose their earnest money. But that's a way a buyer can improve the offer by checking that off and saying, yeah, you know, buyer approval, don't worry about that. Now, what we understand, what the listing agent may or may not understand, in fact, we had one recently where he didn't understand it. He said, oh yeah, we checked that off, so we're not feeling anything. Property approval is still alive and well, totally alive and well. It's only the buyer approval, which has nothing to do with the property, with appraisal, underwriting requirement, nothing. So that only addresses that one thing. But if you've got a solid gold buyer who says, hey, you know, I got the cash to pay for this, I can write a check or whatever, you know, said, I just want to improve it. Then you might say, well, why don't you just make a cash offer? You got that kind of money, because it would certainly improve your offer, because most sellers, and I think, by the way, it's a mistake, but most sellers look at cash offers as a better offer. That's not always the case. I see cash offers fall out for a lot of reasons, and many cash offers end up closing with financing. So just starting off with cash In fact, there's one title company person out there, very noteworthy attorney in our area, who actually advised on one of her little podcast things is, yeah, start off with cash because you can change the financing. Just makes it look good right up front. Question? You're good? Margie, you look like you had a question.
No.
Okay, good.
I mean,
Yeah.
You could change the financing, but you gotta show up and close on time.
You got to close because you don't get any contingencies if you do that, because you got to close on the terms. The only little click, the only little challenge. We got it worked out, but it was really iffy for a while. If the buyer's lender says, you know what, we've got to amend the contract to reflect the financing. Well, typically that's done at closing. And we're at closing, the seller's about to get their money and they don't care. But if the seller does care, because he's sitting there with a backup contract better than this one, he can't require the seller to amend the contract. And if the seller doesn't agree to amend the contract and the buyer's lender says, well, then we're not going to fund the loan, buyer's in default. So this buyer who's going to make that change needs to understand, bottom line, if you got all that cash, you better be ready to get it because you're about to be in default as you work through that. So it's a risk situation. Questions on that? We good? Semi? It's so everybody good with third-party financing, and particularly as it talked about with the appraisal addendum. Now, under property approval, I'm sorry, before I go, I do want to make sure we're clear on the timelines. Under property approval, second page, third-party financing addendum, there's a different timeline for conventional and FHA and VA for the buyer to terminate. One, if it's conventional, it's before the third day prior to closing. So you really, if you've got the buyer, you really need to stay on top of, and usually it's the appraisal that comes in late. And you need to stay on top of that and try to get the seller to agree to extend the closing date. Because when that third day hits, your buyer has lost the property approval contingency. It's gone. And if it doesn't appraise out, and that's why he can't close, he's in default. Because he's lost that ability to terminate based on lender's underwriting requirement. So you need to pay attention to that timeline. Now, if it's FHA or VA, that goes all the way to closing. This 3 days doesn't apply to an FHA VA. So you're good with that. And it says so right there in paragraph 4, right before A, you know, it talks about the 3-day notice termination requirements, and 2B does not apply to this paragraph 4, which deals with FHA and VA. So it doesn't apply to that. Everybody good with that? Addendum for HOA. I had a really interesting challenge recently, and I'm trying to remember, there was someone in here, maybe somebody on Zoom. It was a voluntary HOA, and the buyer's agent was determined to use this addendum with the offer. Can't. This addendum is only for a mandatory HOA, not for use with the voluntary. A voluntary HOA is like there is no HOA. And the proper choice should have been made in 6E2 of the contract. Showing there's not a HOA, not a mandatory HOA.
I don't understand. I've had at least 3 listing agents argue with me that I needed to check that.
For a voluntary?
Yes.
Wow. So were you really nice to them and said, oh, you know what? I am so sorry. I thought I understood, but I don't. Let's read this again. Let's see. Addendum for property subject to.
They're both voluntary in the listing on the MLS. And so I didn't send it. And they said they needed it. And I was like, I really don't think you do. But yes, I do. Okay, well. Well, I know, but they were calling me, and it's happened, I think, 3 times.
Well, and the reason they're trying to use this is to give a buyer right of termination.
Well, it was, yeah, no.
And they can't. Can't. You can only use this when there's a mandatory HOA.
It was a listing. But I know.
So I'm glad to hear that you actually had that experience, because I'd heard about one person you've had. Have any rest of you had that happen? Have you had some calls on yours, Marcia, yourself? I'm I mean, there are reasons we have certain addendums for certain situations that don't apply to other situations. And this legislative session that's about to end down in Austin, and I haven't read the final bills, had some bills relating to HOAs to create more transparency and to work through it. And I know at Texas Realtors, we were involved with supporting that and dealing with it because the power of a mandatory HOA is huge. I mean, they can foreclose on a homestead. And so that ability for them to do that, which a voluntary doesn't have, is such a huge difference. It's why we have this whole addendum that addresses that and working through that. So the other thing, and I know I've said this before, at some point, and I, you know, you guys have always been very patient with me and very supportive. Although some of you, because of the relationship, have said, Bob, why are you explaining that one more time? We already understand that. You already told us that. Yeah, but you keep getting it wrong. You know, and because you keep getting it wrong, it seems like maybe I should. And sometimes I say, well, is that kind of the 5% rule? Everybody know what the 5% rule is? If it only happens 5%, you don't need to address it because it's such a small amount of people that, you know, whatever. But it's more than a 5% rule. It's far more than a 5% rule. And it deals with the choice of A1 on the mandatory HOA addendum. And there's a blank there for a number of days. That doesn't mean anything. When I sat on the Work Lawyer Committee, I said, why do we even have this? It doesn't affect the buyer's right to terminate. Doesn't have anything to do with it. It's not a requirement of the seller. The seller's not in default if he doesn't do it in that time frame. What's the point? Well, you know, buyer needs to tell the seller, I'd like to have it, and here's when I'd like to have it. Well, what if the seller doesn't get it to the buyer? Well, he shouldn't do that because then the buyer can terminate. Well, yeah, but that's what it says, doesn't it? So, and I have made no progress in that. I had no support from the attorneys on the committee, and frankly, from half the brokers. Oh, Bob, yeah, we use it all. That's good. We need to have that. It means you don't understand it. You don't understand what's happening there. This blank is a suggestion. Now, it's so misunderstood. In a recent, you know, we're going to talk about this. A lot of agents are putting out guidelines for offers. And in one that one of our agents received, in these, it said for mandatory HOA, for A1, don't put anything less than 20 days. Really? We should send a thank you note. Thank you for the 23-day free option period. And of course, and their explanation was, we don't have to deal with a rush fee. Fine. But they don't understand they're giving up a free option period every day until the buyer gets this information and 3 days after or closing, whichever comes first. It's an absolute right of termination and can be used in place of the option period. It's an absolute right of termination. And that's what they're giving up. So now, because many listing agents, sellers don't understand this, if you've got a buyer that it's not really that important to them, they say, you know what, we'll get it, that's fine, or I'm already familiar with the HOA, I live in the subdivision, you know, I'm fine, and working through it. The buyer may put a long time frame in there to keep them in control. But the buyer needs to understand from day one of the contract, if they don't have the subdivision information as defined in paragraph A, they can terminate the contract. And we're having this happen where, yeah, Cindy certainly knows how this works. And she's been on both sides of this. The day after we're in a contract, buyer decides he wants to terminate. There's been no earnest money, no option paid, nothing like that, but he's HOA, buyer can terminate. And doesn't have to pay the option fee and doesn't have to pay the earnest money. And the listing agent is just mad as heck, aren't they, Cindy?
Yes, they were mad at me.
Yeah, because yeah, but we understood it and we understood how that works.
I got yelled at quite a few times. Oh, email, text, and phone call.
But think how important it is for our buyer to understand that. Marjorie?
So as the listing agent, you want to have that subdivision information already, so you can send it immediately.
Yes.
Yeah, you see, that's the key from the seller side. You have the conversation with the seller and say, here's what you're giving up until we get this to the buyer. And if it's a hot piece of property that we know we're going to get into contract pretty quickly, go ahead and order up the information. The big time sensitive information is a resale certificate. We'll get all that done and have that taken care of. Now, seller needs to understand they got to pay for it. And just like right now, and the HOA is going to say, yeah, we want it. And what the seller can do, they can order it up themselves, but most HOAs only want to hear from the title company. So get the title company to do it, and title company says, oh, seller's got to pay for it. But that way, now, just putting it in MLS, by the way, doesn't satisfy the issue. You really have to deliver it to the buyer's agent, such as an email. Now, all we're really talking about here, the big thing we're talking about is a resale certificate. All the rest of the subdivision information is already recorded in public records. And that's required under the law. The HOA has to have that information. Now, you probably have that maybe on a disk or a thumb drive or whatever way. So it'd be easy for you to send that to a buyer's agent along with the resale certificate. And the resale certificate is what the HOA is going to really charge for. Because they've already got all the rest of it on a little disk. Oh, yeah, here, fine. But they had to just update the resale certificate and get that done. And even updated resale certificate, it's only like $50 or something like that. Yes, sir.
So number 1 and 2, the first sentence really doesn't, but it has the blanks.
It does in 2. It does in 2.
Oh, I guess it doesn't.
And 2 is a different animal. I'm glad you brought that up. It doesn't in 1, except as a suggestion. Now, here's your problem with the timeline in A1. It's what the title companies are doing. And we've had them say this just with a straight face. Okay, I know you got 10 days in there. We went ahead and ordered it up for your seller to keep them in compliance with the contract. We didn't want your seller to be in default.
Right.
Really?
The other issue with that is now the buyers or the sellers are paying huge rush fees. Because the HOA companies say that we need by law 10 days. And if you need less than 10 days, we're going to charge
Plus after 10 days, they have an extended time frame of additional 10 days upon written request. So they really have 20 days.
So they do.
Now, here's your challenge, and you bring up the rush fee. When your seller is going through this process and deciding what to do here, presuming your seller hasn't said, "Well, let's get this done right away," but you're going to wait until you get into a contract, because we are seeing even on great properties, a little extended days on market. So sellers, let's wait and see what we're going on a contract, working through it. Seller needs to be talking to their HOA, tell us what the timeline is for a rush fee. And, what are we dealing with there? Now, what a title company should be doing is, before they order this up, especially if there's any potential at all for a rush fee, in some cases, 10, 15 days still generates a rush fee. So in a case like that, the title company needs to talk to the listing agent or the seller to get an approval. We had one title company that didn't do that when it ordered up. I think it was a 7-day time frame. And title company said, "Well, we want to keep them in compliance." I said, "Well, then guess what? You're going to pay the rush fee." And they did, because we didn't approve it. We didn't approve for them to order it up within that time frame to generate a rush fee. And so you've got to make sure you're in conversation with the title company about what they're going to do in working through this, because they don't understand this number of days doesn't mean anything. Certainly is not a performance default issue for the seller. Just not there at all. And yet I've had lively discussions with title company attorneys, not the 2 or 3 big ones that we're well familiar with, but some of the smaller ones. I said, "Oh, Bob, this really is a performance issue. I think technically," I said, "you want to show me the court case?" Because there's not any, and there's no requirement for to do that. Marjorie?
So we could really and should maybe have our seller order the subdivision information before we go on the market.
Sure.
And then we can send it as soon as we get it.
Including the resale certificate. Absolutely. And this is a great plus for you in the listing. I promise you, when you explain this to the seller and the importance of it, and the free option period, particularly when they'll be getting offers with no option period and help them understand what it is, they'll say, wow, you know stuff nobody else knows.
Most of them last 90 days, correct?
What?
The resale.
Resale, it depends on the title company. Some title companies will accept one 30, 60, 90, legally 180 days, but most title companies won't accept any past 90. So you need to talk.
The lender also.
Yeah, lender's also involved in a resale certificate for the CD. So whatever the time frame is that they require, you need to look at, because those are time sensitive. Those are time dated. Hello, Jeannie. How are you? You got the material, okay? I was waiting to be careful not to say anything really important, 'cause I knew you were coming. And I said, and then Cindy's getting ready to leave any minute now, because she said, Bob, I was just, So we're now on the addendum for HOA, mandatory addendum. We're on pardon me? Yeah, we're still going to talk about paragraph C. But because Nick cleverly brought up number 2, as a seller, as a listing agent, you need to know there's not just one choice under paragraph 8. There are 4 choices. And when the seller's got a hot piece of property they're going to counter, seller needs to understand they can choose something besides just accepting A1, because A1 gives a buyer termination rights. Now, it's a different animal for A2. The timeline begins to mean something in A2. Number 2, I have no explanation. I haven't talked to anybody on Board Lawyer Committee who can explain to, well, here's what we're doing here. Really? The buyer is obtaining it and giving it to the seller? Really? And the buyer has some challenges in here, and there's a timeline, and there's a great little phrase that when I want to create a nice definition for vagary, this phrase here, where you talk about beyond buyer's control. What the heck does that mean? Here's the only example that we've had, because this is rarely ever used, but the one that we had it, they couldn't get the HOA in the time frame here to provide the information beyond the buyer's control. Now, because the buyer beyond their control couldn't do it, they couldn't get it to the seller, they had a right to terminate the contract. But it was tied to the days. So the number of days in 2 means something, because if it can't get it in this time frame and it's beyond their control, it creates termination rights, whereas it doesn't mean anything in A1. So A2 is such a different animal. I just don't have any explanation for why you even use A2. Now, the seller could counter using 3, because all 3 deals with is an updated resale certificate, which is fairly inexpensive, and they could work through that and go through this. And a buyer may terminate and go through the process if they receive that information. Buyer within 10 days after, and they got a payment for it and so forth. 4 is the one that's set. Nick?
I know, I'm sorry, I'm talking about. I can see why buyers choose number 2 though.
Oh, okay, fine.
Because the buyers are paying for it multiple offers. So
Yeah, sure.
On their listings, they're saying, okay, seller, we're.
Okay, so.
That's why these.
So you're going to explain that to the listing agent. Hey, because normally it's A1, which creates big time in termination rights for my buyer. Plus, we're asking you to sell or pay for it. But when we check off 2, we're going to obtain it, we're going to pay for it. And that's a good point. You're going to need to explain to the listing agent, because they won't understand it.
Yeah.
The number of agents who actually read A2 is probably below the 5% rule,
In this room.
except for this room.
I think they just read viral pay and it's like, oh.
Yeah, oh, yeah, sure. Yeah, that's true. But now 4, seller countering, great piece of property, especially if the seller has information about who the buyer is, and the buyer already lives in that same subdivision. All especially those who deal with more expensive properties, people are moving from one part of Lakeside on Preston to another side. Same thing, Chandler's and with Castle, and people are in the same subdivision. Well, they already know about the data. They already have the subdivision. All they really may need is a resale certificate. And we talked about that under D. And so, the seller counters with 4. And what that does is takes away any termination rights for the buyer, depending on the receipt or non-receipt of the subdivision information. So what the seller is saying is, hey, you don't need this, and buyers say, well, okay, I need it or don't need it. And by the way, even if 4 is checked off, under the law, the buyer still has the ability to call the HOA and obtain the information. They still have the right to do that. Now, most HOAs don't understand the law and whoa. We want to hear from title company, or you're not the seller. Who do you think? And you better be in a contract, by the way, or they won't talk to you at all. Yes, ma'am.
Is there a place online where you can get that information?
Yeah, you can go to public records and get everything except for the resale certificate. Yeah, absolutely. Now, that is the law. Having said that, smaller HOAs haven't done it because they're dealing with totally voluntary people. In fact, one of your challenges with your smaller HOAs and voluntary people, you can't find them to get the information.
So if you're trying to win the multiple offers and you have the buyer, if you check that, it's selling less.
If you checked off 4, I think that improves your offer. I really do. Now, your buyer needs to understand what just happened. And the title company is going to require an updated resale certificate, and you're going to check off and D who's going to pay for that. But I think it improves the offer. Having said that, everything you do in that offer that makes it better, you need to send that list that we talked about yesterday to the listing agent and say, here's the great things we've done on the buyer side for your seller.
Well, sometimes too, when you're talking about the appraisal and you're going over however many thousands of dollars and it's a huge number that you're having to deal with the HOA, towards the appraisal, and it's still money to the seller. Because it helps you not to look for however many more thousands of dollars.
Yep.
Sometimes they're big.
Yep.
I have a buyer right now that it's a 0.5% to the seller to sell, to transfer. It's called a capital, what do they call it? A community benefit fund. It's a 0.5% that the seller has to pay to close it. And we said that we would pay that, but we offered that much less.
Well, but that's addressed in paragraph C.
Right. No, I know, but we said we would pay it. So that's.
Now, so as Cindy cleverly brought this up, let's talk about paragraph C. And what we have, first of all, if you've got the listing, your seller needs to know how much it is. All the fees, everything, because the change in this addendum includes everything. In the old addendum, we separately in a separate paragraph dealt with the reserves and the capital funds, things like that. None of that counts. And the title company will close according to the terms of the contract, according to the terms of this addendum. So whatever is in here is all the buyer pays and seller pays everything else. Everything else. So if you've got the listing, you need to know how much that is. Your seller needs to know how much that is. So the buyer puts $100 in there and it's $2,500 for everything. Seller needs to know that. And you're on the buyer side, you need to know that to make this better for the seller. But you know what I'm not a fan of are things like percentages, where a buyer says, we'll pay 50%. That's a blank check. Buyer just signed a blank check.
Oh, no. The HOA charges a 0.5% of whatever the sale price is to the seller. No,
but they can't do it. See, they can't do it anymore. We need to understand that's changed because of the terms of this addendum. The HOA doesn't get to say, well, this is what the seller is going to pay. And the title company is going to close based on what's in paragraph C. So HOAs don't have the latitude they used to have. Now, having said that, they've got their own little empire, and frankly, some of them out there are just real. We want to charge a Peter fee, and they're going to do whatever they're going to do. And say, well, you know what? If you don't like that, don't move into our subdivision. Okay, fine. Don't sell a house, and it's just so. But that's the rule. I mean, and the title company, good title company, is going to close based on this. So if your buyer though is to improve the offer, is going to do this, and it's certainly not a bad thing to say. We've been told the HOA is going to charge 0.5% of the sales price to the seller. Well, guess what? It's covered in paragraph C, and we're willing to pay that. So we're going to put a dollar amount in here. Now, if you put 100% in here, which some of you have actually suggested, that's a blank check. Buyer just signed a blank check, gave it to somebody, says, go ahead and fill in the amount later. Please let me know so I can put it in my little checkbook. But whatever it is, I'll pay it. So if you need to know what the dollar amount is, and go ahead and put the dollar amount in there. Don't put some percentage, because that's an open. That just really is. Whatever, we'll take care of it. And in many cases, when the buyer discovers how much it really is, he looks at you and says, "Wow, you didn't explain that to me." And they'll look to you to take care of the gap, whatever that might be. So, but we need to understand the title company is going to close based on this. So, listing side, you need to know how much it is. Buyer side is you're trying to help, like in Cindy's case, you help the seller by, hey, this is what the HOA says they're going to do. And we don't want to get into a discussion with whether they can do it or not do it with the seller. Just say, here's what they're saying. And by the way, on the buyer side, we're going to take care of that. Don't worry about it. We're gonna take care. We're gonna pay all that. We're gonna pay all those costs. Remember what the HOA said, we're gonna take care of all of it. And then do that. That was an important change in this addendum. And it's how the title companies are closing based on that. Does that make semi-sense, Cindy? We kind of semi good with that?
Super fast.
Yes,
So if someone is writing like here's what we require from like an offer.
so like the listing agent has put, here are guidelines for the offers,
Yes, yes,
okay?
yes. Would they be able to put like in the HOA, blah, 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 on C and then put the exact number?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Yeah, and they can say, if they have the number, which hopefully they would, they can say, we expect the buyer to pay all the costs under paragraph C, put a dollar amount in there, or simply say, we expect the buyer to make an offer where they're paying all the costs, like in Cindy's case, and covering the seller. So yeah, that could be part of it. But, when you get that listing agent who says for A1, at least give us 20 days. You're welcome. Drives me nuts, drives me nuts. We good on the HOA? Yes, sir.
Not to confuse everything, but just for.
Well, chances are you will
Because some
though.
of us do condos, is all of this pretty much the same as condos, like.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought condos. It's very similar. There are a couple of big differences. One, you never use this addendum with a condo. And it says so right at the top of the addendum. Huh? Use this for a townhome. Now, you always need to make a distinction whether it's actually a townhome or a condo, different form of ownership. But you can't use this with a condo, says so right there. Now we're used to condominiums. So all condominiums have properties owner association. The other is the timeline for termination. In paragraph 2 of the condo contract, resale contract, check contract. If the buyer is going to terminate based on the receipt of the documents, the condo docs, they've got to do so before the 6th day. And the requirements for how they terminate are not the same as in paragraph 21, the notices paragraph. Hand delivered, certified mail, return receipt requested. They can't just send an email and terminate under a condo doc. Because condominiums, the condominium ownership is under a different set of statutes in Texas than the detached single family. So there are only really 3 forms of ownership in Texas. You got the condominiums, you got the single family detached, and you have cooperatives. And the only cooperatives that I really know about down on Maple, there are a couple down on Maple, but other than that, we don't have that form. You get in some other states like New York, cooperatives all the time. The big high rise, it's cooperative ownership. So you've really got to determine sometimes, because townhomes, for example, sometimes in condominiums, sometimes used as marketing terms. Used as marketing terms. They'll call it a townhome when it's actually a condominium. That's just what they call it. So you always need to determine which it is, so you'll know which contract form you use. If it actually is a condominium and you use the 1 to 4 family contract form, and this deal goes south, the track will find you negligent. So you need to make sure you use the right contract form. Sometimes it's hard because the listing agent will put an MLS as a condo and it's not, or as a townhome and it's actually a condo. So you've got to check on it. And I think the final big check is talk to the title company, say, you've got experience, you know what's going on in the subdivision. What are they? The condos, the townhomes, because you can have row house townhome, but in those townhomes, the owners of each of those townhomes not only owns the building and has a party wall agreement with the people next door, they own the land. And that's the big difference. Condominiums don't own the land. And so that's a big distinction. And you need to make sure you're clear on which one it is. Sometimes that's hard. Sometimes listing agents don't know. Oh, we sold a bunch in this and it's all we always do. I said, well, just because you've always done it wrong doesn't mean you get to keep doing it. So we got to work through that. But yeah, so you would use in paragraph 2, we've got it rather than addendum because all condos have the property owner association. That's why it's in the contract. Does that make semi-sense? We good? So Max, you hot or cold? You turn that colder or hotter? So is everybody hot and you want to cool it off a little bit? Is that what everybody's thinking? Remember, if it's not right, it's Max's fault. Now, in the contract itself, because that's what you've got in your next little thing, as I'm moving through all this, if you got something that kind of semi-relates to this, please ask the question, say, well, Bob, slow down. I really need to know about this. Any significant experiences you're having with the new contracts, paragraph 4 of the leases, dealing with the controls on paragraph 2C, any of those kinds of issues, dealing with the delivery of option to the escrow agent, i.e. the title company. And by the way, if the buyer is going to extend the option period and have an additional option fee, who does it get paid to? Seller. Seller. Additional option fee is paid to the seller because they did not change the language on the TREC promulgated amendment form. And item 6 there still deals with it's paid to the seller. Now, the reason for that is most of the time it's a very small amount, $1, $5, $10. And the broker company said, and the title company attorneys said, we don't want to find ourselves receiving $10. Because sometimes it's $10, it's a cash, sometimes it's $1. So they said, we don't want to deal with that, so we're just going to have it paid to the seller. Yes, ma'am.
How many backup offers can a seller get?
Okay, great question. So the question with those on Zoom who didn't hear Jeannie's question, how many backup offers? 2 answers to that. First, there's no technical limit to the number of backups, but to use the TREC promulgated backup contract addendum, that can only be used on the first backup contract. So if you're going to have more, if you're going to be in the second position, an attorney has to draw that up. Because you can only use that addendum for the first position, first backup position. But yeah, there's no technical limit to how many you can have. And in this hot market, I'm surprised we haven't had more buyers say, okay, I understand there's a contract, there's a backup, we want to get next in line. Because sometimes deals fall apart, and they do, but they're going to have an attorney take care of that for them because you can't use the TREC addendum.
We've run into a couple of issues like doing wire transfers into the title companies. They're doing whatever. So they do that for $6,000, but title company won't accept that. So now they're out $6,000. So then they have to wait a couple.
Okay, they send what?
Not a wire. It's a type of wire. And a lot of buyers don't.
This is for the earnest money?
Yeah.
To the title company, and they won't accept it?
Right.
They don't accept it for good funds either. So for closing, they can't, it's an ACH is what it's called. They will not accept.
I don't know what that is.
It's a type of wiring.
Yeah, so that's been an issue. And then also if they're doing certified checks from like Bank of America.
Yeah.
Some buyers are still putting the seller's name on the option check. So then that won't count. So they have to go back to the bank to get that.
Get another one.
So now they're getting checks in past the 3 days.
Okay.
For option. So,
So now, okay, so Nick, the solution to this is what?
Educating this.
One, knowing that it's an issue.
Yeah.
And second, understanding the title company has control over this. Under the good funds rule, the TDI, they can decide here's what we need. Here's what we require. And if you don't give it to us this way, we're not going to accept it. And if the title company won't accept it and the buyer hasn't delivered the earnest money in the timeline, seller can terminate the contract. Would be great because they got a backup scenario they like a lot better anyway. So your buyer just lost out. So you need to make sure you understand when you're writing an offer, and since you're writing the offer, you may be using the buyer's title company or you may be using the preferred title company, it's an MLS or the seller. You talk to them and say, okay, my buyer needs to know what are good funds for you. How do you need to see this money?
Well, it's not my buyers because my buyers agree. It's on our listings. This is happening. So I think that we need to have.
So on your listing,
buyer's agent saying, this is what you need to do.
So you got the listing. And so, okay, so maybe in the offering instructions, you can say buyer or buyer's agents need to coordinate with the title company on good funds, on how they need to receive the earnest money. Because if they don't do it correctly, this creates a problem for that buyer. He could lose out on the contract. Seller could terminate it after 3 days.
That's what we're learning.
So I think this might be a good example of a good instruction to a buyer says, hey, make sure you cross this off your list and you do this. That's a good point. Absolutely. Because, the title companies, when this change was made, with all these things, the new things, option fee, everyone, title companies got much more aggressive on the good funds rule. And they say, we're going to determine how we get money and how we deal with that. Because one of the things they're dealing with now is when the buyer pays that option fee to the title company, and sellers now want the option fee, $250, $500 option fee. And I was visiting with Kelly Wald over at Republic one day. We were discussing about what's going on. And she said, well, Bob, this just happened. It happened yesterday. And I almost called the police, but we went and took care of it. She had a seller who came in and demanded the option fee. We're in contract. It was like $500. I want the money and I want it now. And it was a lady, by the way, who wasn't very much of a lady, and she said, she cussed at me and cursed at me and yelled and screamed and yelled and said, I want my money. I want my money now. And I said, well, what'd you do? Well, I gave her money. I finally just said, here's money, fine, go away. But sellers need to understand that they're just not going to get this money like they did before. It's going to be at the title company. And title company's not going to give it to them unless there's a request. And then the title company has to make sure the funds have cleared and it's good funds, or they're not going to give it to the seller. So seller needs to understand, here's the new rule here. Now, for most sellers, it won't matter. They weren't looking to have that money anyway. But and most title companies say, this works out great. In fact, buyers say, I'm glad because the title company's holding on to it. So at closing, it's going to be the title company handled it. So it won't be a debit or credit because the seller never got it. It's going to be a credit. Buyer just gets it closing. So that whole option fee thing, and hadn't thought about that aspect of it. Title companies doing that, but that's certainly you need to really educate a buyer's agent. So when you've got multiple offers, especially if you've got a buyer who's using a title company different than the one that your seller preferred and one you're not real familiar with, you say to that buyer's agent, hey, you need to talk to that title company and find out what your buyer's going to have to do to pay them the earnest money to make sure we don't have a hiccup here. So that's a great point.
You ask for hiccups.
Pardon me?
You ask what hiccups are happening.
Well, and that's a big one, isn't it? That could be a huge
10
one.
days to clear thing.
Well, it's turned out to be a much shorter time frame, but the concept is clear. The title company says it's got to be good funds before we release anything. And then the challenge is the manner of how they release it. I mean, if it's only $100 or $150, title companies love to wire things, but sellers should go, don't wire me any money. I may have on my bank side a wiring fund. So don't send me $100 that you're going to wire. Figure out a different way to do it. And, they could just cut a check and then the seller or the agent can come by and pick it up. But the manner and how they get it to them is really going to be the policy of the title company and how they want to do that. Yes, ma'am.
What is the average winning option that you see?
It's a great question. What are you guys seeing? Because they certainly have gone up. What are you seeing for option? 1,500. Okay. Are you guys seeing 500 and 1,000 much more often? For what price ranges?
This was just for 470,000.
Wow, 1,500. Wow. Okay, now, did you have the buyer or the seller?
I have the seller.
That may be a seller who wants their money right away.
No, it's a buy. The seller didn't.
I mean, the seller may say $1,500 option fee. That's really good. I'd like to see that right away. I want to see it just in case it falls apart. I want that money. But what's the risk to the buyer? $1,500 option fee. What's the risk to the buyer?
If it goes through the contract.
Do what?
If it's the option goes through the contract, like if it's for the closing, it can go to the closing as well. Or the buyer will lose it.
They lose it if they want for it.
That's true. They could lose it. I mean, if they terminate under that provision or whatever, if it doesn't close. But haven't they just lost significant leverage to negotiate anything else with the seller? Seller says, you know what? I'm not going to do any repairs and thanks for the $1,500. Have a nice day. I mean, you lost a lot of leverage when you do that. And the more you're paying out, one of our agents had the seller and the buyer put up 20,000 in the option. It's crazy. I mean, and if you've got the buyer I want to see an email explain the risk to your buyer. I want them to acknowledge you've explained, because 90% of the time, who is this buyer? They're from California, and they're not very bright anyway. Although they were smart enough to get out of California, right, Marjorie? At least they did that. And they're doing things so differently there. My son is in Salt Lake City, and he says that market up there is just like ours, crazy, but they're doing some things that are just standard, typical in their marketplace that we don't do here, like the escalation clause. So different animal as we work through it. But yeah, you've got to have that conversation, work through it. And if the buyer chooses to do that to really improve, because frankly, a $1,500 option fee is a bribe. Buyer saying, here's $1,500. So just for me to be in the honor of a contract with you, do whatever you want to, here's $1,500.
So what do you suggest to do? What are y'all doing to win the multiple offers? I've got a $500,000 buyer that I can't finally.
Well, mostly fine.
Right.
I can have good relationships with the other agent if he can
Oh, I
establish
do that, trust me. That's
Well, I really liked a lot what Lindsay talked about yesterday in that relationship with the listing agent and really doing that. If the listing agent likes you, feels good about you, listing agents have some influence on which offer the seller accepts or doesn't accept. So anything you can do to, I think that's a big deal. Yes, ma'am. Okay. And see, that presumes the seller wants a cruise. Yeah, so, wouldn't help me. So but I've been on cruises and I don't want to go anymore. So that's okay.
How do you even write that in the contract?
We have a good attorney who prepares it. Yeah, good language from an attorney on giving this. And we're having listing agents who are offering up cruises to seller if you'll list with us. I had that on the news recently. Yes, ma'am.
So I'm seeing option fees anywhere from $250 to $10,000, $15,000, something like that.
It's
But I'm
crazy.
also seeing option periods that are existent and.
Or what?
That they're there, they have option period. So there are people who are under the impression that you don't necessarily have to have an option period, which is fine. But I think we have to be careful that when we talk to the buyer, we don't say, don't have an option period, put in, $1,500.
Yeah, you can never recommend it. You can never recommend it. You can have it as a conversation about a strategy. Here's a strategy for a buyer that may help out as you work through it. We have to be careful because when you look in paragraph 5.8.2 of the contract, and you got the contract there, we're having buyers who will put the option fee in there and not put the number of days for an option period. Well, they don't have an option period. And so they miss some of the blanks because it's a different format than we had before as you work through it. Are you seeing much shorter option periods?
Yeah, but they're still existent.
They're still there. It's just shorter. Okay. And of course, we just talked about the HOA addendum. So a buyer can get away with a much shorter option period when they got the HOA addendum because they've got that protection there, unless they already have all that information right now.
Which they probably won't.
And they probably won't. And 90% of the time they won't. And so as they kind of go through that. Now, you're going to have to really explain. In fact, if you have a hard time explaining to a listing agent how this works, give Cindy a call because she's been through it. She understands that now. She knows how to respond to being yelled at. Go ahead, all that. But
It's not for the faint of heart, they were mean.
but these same listing agents.
It's not a trick, it's a contract.
I know.
It's written in clear and understandable language, in my opinion. But anyway, so the challenge though is not only do they have that, but they also want to control the inspections. Well, you know what? You got a 5-day option period. That's when you got to do your inspections. And we explained to her, we're blue in the face back there, 7A, talking about inspections. One has nothing to do with the other, but and we've got some really big companies out there who don't understand this. And you find yourself having to really explain to them, make sure they understand and work through that process, because it does get to be a challenge. So other than those things, anything else you guys are seeing in paragraph 5 with the earnest money and the option? And I haven't heard anybody say they have a problem because they didn't put the right amount in there and we didn't make sure we covered both the option and the earnest money to not give the seller a right to termination. Yes, ma'am.
I would think if the option.
Yeah, sometimes a seller will look at the earnest money as a big factor. I think that's especially true on a cash transaction. I think if a buyer is going to pay 500,000 cash and he's going to close in 2 weeks, I think it's very reasonable for the seller to say, where's the money right now? And I think on a deal like that, a seller likes to see 100,000 in earnest money. I want to see some serious, I don't want to see 5,000 earnest money, because where's the rest of the money? Where's the other 495,000? No, it doesn't. It really doesn't. And it looks like it's not truly a cash buyer. Because we want to know where the money is today. I want to know it's in a financial institution in this country today. I don't want to hear about this transferring funds it's been long enough that you may not have remembered the story, but it's down in Highland Park. And it finally came to fruition because one of our agents ended up as the agent du jour for this buyer, young man, looking at really expensive properties and 10, 12, $15 million properties. And one day, and this was our agent when they were there, was at a property, and the seller was there because he had a bunch of blueprints and things, how they'd done the property and stuff like that. Was kind of showing this buyer, young man, he was in his early 30s. And the seller finally looked at the young man and says, Sonny, do you know how much I'm asking for this property? $9.5 million. You look kind of young. You got that kind of money? Yeah, inheritance. Well, Highland Park inheritance is very common thing. Oh, yeah, good. Said, well, I'm sorry to hear that. I said, father, my uncle, well, I'm sorry to hear he passed. Well, he hadn't actually passed. But I'm on the list and he's not looking good. Kid didn't have any money. I mean, he had everybody in the world chasing to show him properties. He didn't have $1. You know, I'm on the list. It's like, you know what? I buy lotto every day and I'm feeling pretty good. But I just, you know, it's crazy. So we got to really make sure when people are doing this that they're serious about it. But we are having the challenge. The thing that's happening, and people aren't really thinking through it, is a seller who's sitting there with a backup contract is just looking for all that's better than this one, better than yours, is looking for ways to kill this deal. And they're really paying attention to that earnest money. And they're looking at that 3-day time frame. And sometimes what happens is people just really don't pay attention. They don't get it right there in time, and just really need to stay on top of it. Now, what some listing agent sellers don't understand is what that 3 days actually means. It's 3 full days. It's not just until the title company closes. It's till 11:59 p.m. that third day. Because we've had sellers, listing agents, try to terminate as soon as the title company closes. Oh, buyer didn't get it in the title company. It's closed. We're terminating. No, you're not. Because you got to give them the entire full day. So because they're sitting there just itching, trying to get rid of your deal and move on. So you need to kind of watch that and make sure it gets in time. And of course, now that we can combine the option fee and the earnest money, you need to understand, because sometimes it's not a big deal if we get the earnest money in that 3rd or 4th or 5th day. But if we've included the option fee in that one amount, then our buyer just may have lost their option because they didn't get that in time. So we need to kind of really stay on top of that. So we good with that? Something that we haven't talked about a lot, but as we're going through the process and writing offers, that we're trying to help the seller out in a lot of ways. One of them is dealing with the survey. And many buyers say, okay, we're not going to have a seller give us an existing survey and have to go get an affidavit done. We're going to go ahead and get a new survey because we've listened to Bob's agents and they've told us that the buyer needs a new survey and we like that, so we're getting that. So when you do that, so you're checking off, 6C2. And there is an important timeline there. And this time frame there is important because it relates to 6D, the objection timeline, which we'll talk about in a minute. But when we look at that time frame, as you work through this, the buyer needs to make sure they give themselves plenty of time. Because once the survey is done, the buyer owes for the survey whether they close or not. There are a couple of survey companies that will forgive that, but most of them won't. And so the buyer is now having to pay for a survey on a property he's not going to buy. So it's fairly typical to put about 20 days in there. And if you're in an area where surveys are really stacked up and busy and you can't get to them in a time frame, then maybe longer. But there's an important relationship between this because of the last sentence in 6C2, where it talks about buyers deemed to receive the survey on the date of actual receipt or the date specified in this paragraph, whichever is earlier. So if the buyer puts a shorter time frame, he puts 10 days in here, but he doesn't get the survey for 15 days. His rights of objection in 6D are tied to the 10 days, number of days in that blank, not to when they receive it. Because what buyers were doing is stretching things that, okay, we still a little bit of iffy on the deal. Let's wait a little bit before we get it. Because, hey, it's our survey. We're getting it. We're paying for it. So we'll decide we're going to get it. No, not if you've got a number of days in there. Because your right of objection is tied to that number of days, not to your receipt, unless you receive it in a shorter time frame than that number of days, whichever's earlier. So your buyer needs to know whatever timeline they put in here when they get it is going to impact on their right of termination.
So you recommend always putting 2?
I think a buyer should, first of all, get a new survey. I think when you're trying to improve the offer, 6C2 is better for the seller. You're going to need to remind them of that. You say, hey, here's why we're doing 6C2. One, buyer should have a new survey anyway. Second, we don't want your seller to have the hassle on. Buyers are making offers with 6C1 in spite of the fact, and the seller's disclosure or the seller says they don't have a survey. And they're still checking off 6C1 for an existing survey. Well, that clouds your offer. You're asking the seller to pay for a new survey because they don't have one to give the buyer. So it just cleans it up dramatically with 6C2. Buyer says, we're going to get a survey. We're going to pay for it. We'll handle it. Seller, don't worry about it. We're not going to have you have to go out and find somebody to notarize that T47 and fill that out like it. So don't worry. I think it just really improves the offer. Makes it a much cleaner offer. It's one of those little things. Now you're going to have to remind the listing agent, here's what we've done. Here's 6C2. Here's why it's better for your seller. You're going to have that conversation. I think 6C2 is.
Do you think all buyers should buy their own surveys?
Absolutely, without question. And whether the buyer does or not, 80% of the buyers are going to go for 6C1. They just want that exist. They want to save a few bucks. But we should always, in my opinion, advise them to get a new survey.
So when you tell them that, they say, why? And
Well, because there are mistakes on surveys. If you use an existing survey and surveyors have made a mistake, you have no recourse against the surveyor.
doesn't the title company catch it?
Oh no. Title company, it's not their job to review the survey and make sure it's okay. Because unless you check off 6A8, which is right above 6C, you're going to check 6A8. When you look at that, page 2 of the contract, where the buyer is going to amend the survey exception. If the buyer does not amend the survey exception, title company doesn't care because they have no liability on the survey. That's a standard exception. When you look at your title insurance policy, there's a section of that policy that says, standard for an exception. And one of those exceptions is the survey. If you amend it, most of that exception goes away. What still remains is shortage in area. That still is an exception in the title insurance policy. So if you amend it, if the buyer amends it, now the title company cares about the survey because you can file a claim with the title company, which is what you were thinking.
Yeah.
So you recommend amending it?
I do recommend amending it because you never, except for a new survey, you never have any recourse against the surveyor. So you want that ability to file a claim with the title company. I think you should amend it on both, as you're going through the situation, both new and existing surveys. even though on a new survey, you have the surveyor as a recourse, many surveyors are small shops. They've retired, they've gone out of business, they've died, and so they're gone. And so your only thing left is the title company.
Buyers should always pay for that.
Yeah. Hey, buyer should pay for it because it's a very small amount. How much is it? Thank you, Cindy. 5% of premium of the title policy. Unless it's commercial, then it's 15%. And commercial, by the way, is when the buyer is buying under an LLC. It just became commercial. 15% of the premium, just tripled. And by the way, title companies miss this, so pay attention. Title companies will sometimes, you'll see the line item for your buyer and it'll show, and you look at it, and say, boy, that sure looks like a lot more than we thought. And they just pumped in 15%. They just hit the wrong button. So you can only watch that. Marcia?
So I've had some title companies push back on a new survey and say it's not necessary to have it amended because
And they what?
they won't do it. They won't.
They won't do
They
it?
won't, no,
Why would a title company not do it?
because they said it's not necessary, it's a new survey.
Right, if you're paying for it, why do they care?
That's crazy. Okay, so why would you do it? Why would you do it on a new survey? And I just answered that question. Why? Surveyors go out of business. Surveyors die. And if a surveyor is gone, your only recourse is the title company. And it's so inexpensive. You got a $2,000 title policy, it's $100. I mean, the buyer just paid $20,000 more than a list price. And he's worried about $100 to amend the accept. That's crazy. Go ahead and do it on everything. Just, but that doesn't entirely surprise me, although I know they're trying to be protective, say, well, good customer service. We're trying to keep your buyer from paying for things they don't need. And they don't need this. On a new survey, they don't need this. Well, yeah, they may. Now, but if it's a big survey company that's been around for 20 years, be around there 20, it's not a big deal. I understand that. But I like being able to file a claim with the title company. I just like that.
And a lot of times the buyer doesn't know who the survey company is.
Oh, yeah, you're right. And never know. Yeah,
Well, they don't even know they do surveys.
that's true.
I don't listen to the name of it.
And in a cash transaction, So- Yeah.
They did. Pretty colorful.
and in a cash transaction, you don't have a lender requiring it. And title companies don't care unless you're going to amend an exception. You're exactly right. So on a cash transaction, you don't have a lender requiring it. So a buyer can decide if they want one or not. And, they get to make that decision.
Well, they're very foolish saying, no, you can't have one on a new survey.
That's silly.
Maybe, they were the ones that will eventually get sued because they refused to allow. Yeah,
Yeah, that's just nuts.
yeah.
And it's just, and that's probably a title company that touts a lot of good customer service.
So you recommend always checking box 2 and you put 20 days.
I don't say put 20 days. That's a time frame to consider. Why do we consider a longer time frame in 6C2? Because the buyer wants to know this deal looks pretty good before he owes for a survey. So give yourself some time. But remember, it's important to recognize that time frame will relate to 6D, the objections time frame. So we need to be sure we kind of put those two together as we work through that. That makes semi-good sense. Has anybody had any experiences with the smart devices in paragraph 10B? And the passwords and deal with that? Does everybody understand how the buyer, how the seller, if many cases the seller has the same password for multiple uses and they don't want to be giving the buyer this password? So when you take the listing, if they have this situation, seller should change the password to relate specific to this property, so they're not giving up any other passwords. Now, in a recent podcast, Don Moore, Allegiance Title, did a thing of how do you prove up the seller has in fact terminated, because one of the things sellers are required to do in 10B2 is terminate, remove all access. Well, we don't care if the seller's done that, because first thing the buyer's going to do when they take ownership of the property is change them all, change all the passwords. So the seller doesn't have any access to the property, because sellers were having access to the property and doing things. Such as access to the property and raising the garage door and going in. Oh, we forgot about, we forgot we left that. What? Oh, you know, that pool table. We didn't mean to leave that. Oops. So you need to make sure that your buyer makes that change as soon as possible as you work through that.
Or if your seller really hated the buyer, just start turning the lights off.
We had a seller who moved to another state and they were going into the thermostat and changing the temperature. Yeah. Just go, really? Come on, you know, get a life. Crazy. I mean, the stuff that people think are funny out there and think to do, you just go, wow, man, just. Okay, so just very, very briefly, it's in the outline. I don't have a form for it. We've had it in previous classes. And it's the clear cooperation versus the coming soon. We need to understand in the transaction, there's two totally different timelines here. The clear cooperation, those rules out of NAR, that basically says if you publicly market the property, you have 1 business day to get an MLS. They have a little bit of an explanation of what publicly marketed property is, sign in the yard, social media, tell anybody about it. If you tell anybody outside of your office about this property, just the description, you don't even have to give the neighborhood or the city or anything, just got this property and NAR says, whoop, that's a violation. They're right now, NAR is very broad on their interpretation of what this means. So you want to be very careful, but it's a timeline. It's before MLS. It's before you publicly done anything to the property. So if you do anything, or if the seller does anything, and the seller agrees in the listing agreement that we use that it's publicly marketed, the seller agrees that it's going to be put in MLS 1 business day. I mean, that's part of the listing agreement. So sometimes they may tell their friends about it or whatever, and then that's a real problem. So you have to work through that. So that's the clear cooperation thing. The coming soon thing, you've got the listing agreement. It's in MLS. It's coming soon because the seller says, I don't want it fully on the market yet. I've got to do some things, fix it up, whatever, take a nap, whatever got to do. Because the big thing that helps the seller, the reason he's doing that is he understands there'll be no showings. Won't be anybody traipsing through my property. And so that's the big thing during the coming soon period, which maxes out at 30 days. It used to be 14, it's now 30 days. During that time frame, no showings to anyone. And that includes other agents in our office. No one is to see the property. Now, because the seller said, yeah, I want to do it. And you'll occasionally have challenges with other agents in our office say, I've got a buyer, show it. And it's a challenge because we want to help each other out and understand all that, work through that process. So as we deal with that, what happens is we have it anyway in this low inventory, high demand thing. But what we are having in the last 30, 60 days, multiple times we're having sight unseen offers. So when you take the listing and it's going to go in coming soon, you need to have the very active conversation with your seller. If this happens, what do you want to do? And talk to them about the pluses and the minuses of it. And the seller needs to give you instructions in writing, such as an email. I don't want to see anything until we put it on the market, till it's active. I don't see anything. And here's my instruction to you, my listing agent. You get to tell the buyer's agent, thanks for the offer. It will not go to my seller. My seller has given me specific instructions. They don't want to see it. Finally, we'll let you know when it goes active, and then you can send us an offer and my seller see it. Right now, I will not submit any offers to my seller, and I have written instruction to my seller saying so. So that's an instruction to the seller, fine. Your seller may say, well, okay, I'm okay. I'd like to see what people are seeing out there. I'd like to see it. So then you have to submit that offer to your seller. And the challenge you get to then is when the seller decides to accept that offer, and you've given them all the good advice of here's the risk of a buyer who's never actually seen the property, wants to go under contract. And we had that even before the coming soon issue, but and we understand those risks. But your other challenge is you're going to get yelled at by the other buyer's agents. Yeah. When they all of a sudden see an MLS, this is active option. Whoa, no showings. What do you mean it's seller's in a contract? How come you didn't tell us? Then if you'd have told us, we wanted to write an offer too. Well, then why didn't you? You should have. But they didn't know they could. And that's a challenge. You need to know you can. If you've got a buyer who's just desperate, I mean, they're on their 5th or 6th or 7th house they've missed. They say, what in the world can we do? You know, we just want to get in a contract. Just, you know, we know we can't see this house and you can pull up all the coming soons in the area. Let's start making offers and let's see if we got any sellers accepted. And your buyer needs to know, and you need to know you can do that. Now, the risk for the buyer, and you know, the buyer says, okay, well, what are the risks? You're in contract to buy a piece of property you've never seen. You've never been inside. Now you may have the videos, you may have the pictures, you may have whatever, but you've never seen it. Because it's in coming soon in MLS. None of that gets uploaded to Zillow or Realtor.com. However, you can have pictures in there and you work through the price limited as you work through that. Thank you, Marcia. Bye.
Thank you, Marcia.
I'll work on my presentation. We'll get better.
I wish you would.
I will, because I just want you to be happy. Not ecstatic, but happy. And so we got some risk there. So once the buyer is in contract and it'll go into MLS, then the buyer gets to see the house because it's no longer in coming soon. So they get to see the house. Well, the buyer needs to do that right away in case they say, oh my gosh, we didn't know this. Wow, we want out of this deal. Well, they need to be at that point where they can get out of the deal early on. So they need to understand that risk as they go through it. And seller needs to understand the risk that a sight unseen buyer is generally viewed as a riskier buyer. Just like when we have spouses, the trailing spouse situation. One of them has seen the property and the other one hadn't except for videos. And finally, when he or she gets here, say, oh my gosh, what were you thinking? And so there's always that risk as you work through it. But you've got to have that conversation with your seller. What do you want to do about sight unseen offers? And you need written instructions such as an email from that seller. Here's what we want to do. So that you can then tell any buyers about that. And if you got the buyer, it may be a good call to the listing agent. Say, okay, you know, I presume you're okay with this. We're going to make an offer, even though we've not seen it yet. Buying buyer wants to make an offer. You know, are you good with that? We've had listing agents who would not cooperate on any level. One listing agent to our buyer's agent says, no, I'm not going to submit this offer to my seller. It's not on the market yet. It's not active. I'm not going to do it. And then our agent asks us, well, do you have instruction from your seller about that? No, why should I? Well, if you don't have instruction from your seller, you're required under both TREC and NAR to submit all offers to your seller. You're required to do that unless you have instruction otherwise from your seller. And yet many listeners say, well, I'm not going to do it. Okay, fine. And the problem is, if you create a big problem with them right now, later when it goes active and you have multiple offers, it's probably going to come back and bite you. They're going to remember you and they're going to say, I didn't like him. I'm going to tell the seller about this offer.
Isn't it better to wait because when it's in the market, lot more people will apply, you know? It's better for the seller.
Oh, no question about it. In fact, if a seller, I'm glad you brought that up. Here's the other part of this, because we have a form, pre-market advisory form. If our seller accepts an offer, enters into a contract during this period we just talked about, before it's fully on the market, they have to sign this form. It tells them they could almost certainly get more money for it if it goes fully on the market. Now, they get to choose otherwise for a lot of different reasons. But if they do that, they need to understand they could get more and they need to acknowledge that. And we need to sign off. And it even says in there, particularly if the buyer is represented by another one of our agents. And so they need to sign off on that. It's in our intranet. We have that and we've had them previous.
Right now, it isn't. She's got 2 little kids. She does not want to have people.
Oh, and see, there's a lot of good reasons why seller said, this is acceptable. This is a good offer. I like this. I don't want to go through that marketing and all that other mess. So yeah, I absolutely agree with that.
And it's the seller's choice.
It is absolutely the seller's choice. Now, the other flips part of that, the follow-up to that, it's the seller's choice. It's your responsibility to make sure you get written instruction from them, that they understand, they acknowledge your good advice, and then they get to make the choice, but you wisely advise them.
So Bob. do
Yes.
They don't want to, so they don't want to see it. Does, if you tell the agent that, then does the agent say, oh, we'll just hold on to it then, or, and if so.
Well, what you would do, because you've got instruction from the seller, you say, you know what? I've received it. It's an email. It's not opened on any level at all. So I've not opened it, and I won't be giving it to my seller. And say, well, hold on to it. And when it's active, I said, no, when it's active, I expect another offer from you, because things may change over the next week or 10 days or 30 days. Says, you know what, I'm not going to put it in my little packet here and then you're ready to open it up later for Christmas or something. They're going to do that. So now you've got another little handout here, important listing conversations. Some of this we've kind of talked about and dealing with the clear cooperation coming soon, all that. Just talked about the sight unseen offers. And number 4 here, the questions you have to ask of every buyer through their agent, if they have an agent. And we've talked about this in other classes, but we sometimes get a little lax on this. Because we're having buyers making multiple offers on different properties. We've got to ask that agent, is your buyer on offers on other properties? Is your buyer in contracts on other properties? We need to give our seller as much information as they can, because they're sitting there with 5 or 10 offers. And it's a tough thing for a seller to pick out the offer. It's easy to say, here's the one that nets the most. It's hard to find out which one's most likely going to close. And that's a hard deal. And you need to give them as much information as you can about, here's what we know about this buyer. Now, in this market, especially with all the stuff in the media and the newspaper and all the stuff you see where buyers are just weeping and crying and gnashing of teeth and just about to go into therapy and all that stuff because they just can't get anything. It's more understandable and acceptable why buyers are making multiple offers. It's not quite the killer deal it used to be. Back in the good old days, our buyer was making multiple offers is a really flaky buyer. But today it's just a desperate buyer. So today, man, I'm just trying to get a house, trying to buy that apple. Didn't work through that. So it's a little more incentive, but it still is information we want to know, want to work through that. I really want to know, are they in contract on other properties? And I want to know if they have a house to sell, because you don't have to tell us that unless you ask. Now, the challenge is they can lie to us. We understand that. There's no way to protect against the big lie. But at least you want to ask the questions. You want to provide as much good information to your seller as you can and try to help them make a decision if you work through that. So make sure you ask all those questions working through it. Now, we've got an additional little challenge. I don't have it on my list here, but we do need to talk about it because it's begun to be an issue in a number of transactions. And that's the FIRPTA issue. The FIRPTA. Deal with foreign sellers. Paragraph 20. It's close. Half of, but it's very close. But probably, and play in additional information. We've gotten our listing agreement where you ask the seller if they're a foreign person or not. And we do recognize that at closing, all sellers have signed an affidavit saying they're not a foreign person. And title companies, when they're getting all the questionnaire that goes out, that's one of the things that they ask about. The challenge is because the buyer has a risk under FIRPTA that they may end up owing the IRS money for seller's taxes. It's a risk to the buyer, so a buyer would want to know. I says, I want to know if this seller is a foreign person or not. So there are 2 aspects of this. One, if you've got the listing and you already have information that your seller is a foreign person because it said so on the listing agreement. Then the question becomes, are you going to put it in private remarks in MLS? Are you going to in some way, shape or form communicate that to the buyers. That's totally a seller situation. That's not a requirement to disclose. And there's nowhere in the seller's disclosure notice that addresses that. So the challenge is if the seller doesn't agree to that, you can't do it. Because it may put the seller's marketing at risk. There are buyers who may not even see the property because of that issue. And so, in a big hot piece of property may not be a factor. But if you got a piece of property that is anything at all, you've got a really good listing, a nice listing that backs up to the power lines, is on a corner lot, on a busy street, and people from Oklahoma live next door. I mean, all kinds of bad issues. So if you've got a property that's hard to sell, anything you do to reduce the pool of buyers can be a problem for the seller. So you can't do it without permission of the seller. You can't disclose that you have a foreign seller. If the buyer asks you, you can't lie about it, but you can't disclose it. Say, I'm sorry, that's not information my seller has authorized me to disclose. Well, when you said that, by the way, you just disclosed that that's what you got. Otherwise, you'd have said no. Yes, ma'am.
Is that withholding like 30% tax?
Well, it changes. It's generally 15%, but it depends on buyers buying owner occupied, their homestead. It depends on the seller circumstances. It's essentially dealing with, for most practical, the capital gains of the seller on the sale of the property. And it varies dramatically. We don't want to get into a conversation with a buyer saying, here's what it could be, here's what it is. And there's a form, if it is foreign seller, there's a form at closing that the title company has. And it just, the range is dramatic of title companies' involvement in this. Some title company says, you know what, that's totally the buyer and seller's problem. Let them deal with it. We're not doing anything. Other title companies are very involved in it. Republic, for example, helps with the form, helps complete it, helps get the money to the IRS for the buyer. I mean, they really work with them. So it depends. So you've got to be very careful not to say, what we do, for example, with the seller, when they're trying to determine if they are a foreign person or not in the lease agreement, advise them to talk to their attorney, their tax attorney, or somebody that can really advise them what the circumstances are. Say, well, I've got a social security number. I have a green card. I don't have you don't even get into those definitions, because then if you're wrong on any level, you're liable. We're liable. You just want to say, here's an issue, and we suggest that you talk to your attorney, talk to your CPA, talk to whoever about it. But it can be, now the other thing is, for most circumstances, it's if the sales price is 300,000 or above. So you get into those kinds of issues, but don't automatically say, well, this is a $200,000 piece, probably should, it doesn't apply. Well, it probably doesn't, but you don't get to make that decision. What you want to do is make sure that your client has done the investigation, do it. If it's $800,000 piece of property and it's a best property capital gains issue, it's almost certainly will apply. And just one of those cases that if you got the listing, you want to have your foreign seller resolve their tax issues way before closing. We don't want any surprises at closing, because in some cases, there's not enough equity there to cover the cost. And all of a sudden, there's not enough because it comes out of the proceeds of the sale. And there may not be enough there to resolve the issue.
So is it more tax for the buyer or is it?
Yeah, the buyer is the one that has the liability. The IRS will hold the buyer responsible for the seller's taxes
Oh, I see.
and the sale of the property.
If there's not enough equity.
Well, yeah, it depends on, well, they'll hold them if, what they'll say to the buyer, we don't care about the equity situation. Here's the money that's owed and you need to send it to us. Period. End of conversation. We need the money. And the buyer will have to pay the IRS.
Is that only if there's a capital gain in the sale?
Well, don't get into whether there's only a capital gains or not, because now you're practicing law, using your old CPA license and stuff like that. You want to be careful. There's a whole section in the IRS, that explains that. But I tell you what, having read it a few times, I have a lot of questions about it. Oh, I'm not sure what that means. Of course, that's true of a lot of stuff in the tax code. I need to work through that. You should just say, you know what, there's a possibility, there's an issue. Buyer, you need to talk to your CPA or your tax attorney, your tax people to find out what the possibilities are, which means you need some information from the seller. Now, the other side of all this is you've got the buyer, and buyer says, well, I'd like to know. And the buyer would like to know. How are you going to find out? Are you going to call the buyer, the listing agent, and say, hey, our buyer wants to know if your seller is a foreign person?
That just happened to Amy Stubblefield.
Yes, it did. because her seller's name was in. And the buyer said, well, obviously that's foreign person. Well, it wasn't, as it turns out. And the buyer didn't ask for it till like the day before closing, which is crazy because you have to have a affidavit closing anyway. If you're going to ask the listing agent, you know, it's in this case, they weren't even asking, say, you know, clearly this is a foreign seller. Look at the name. Everybody could see that. Or you talk to me, well, I can tell by their accent, they're foreign. That's just how that is. If you're going to ask, you've got to ask every listing agent on every property your buyer has an interest in. Every single one. If you just pick and choose, you've just discriminated. If your buyer says, well, I'd like to know, okay, on every property you have any interest in, we've got to ask. And let the listing agent know, I understand the rules to keep from discriminating. Our buyer would like to know, and we're asking this of every listing agent on every property my buyer has an interest in. You do that, then at least you can ask the question. Whether you get a legitimate answer or not, at least you can ask the question. Otherwise, you can't do it. The most important part of all this, though, is the title company's role. You need to ask the title company, what's your role in a foreign seller issue? Or how involved are you? Do you help the buyer in case it comes up a situation where they need to send money to them? You know, you need to be involved in that.
Can I ask another question on this?
Yes, sir.
So I get everything you said, but let's say the buyer has limited funds. They don't have enough to cover the 15% or whatever it is. I don't want to get into details. Let's say they don't have enough money and now they can't close. There's no stipulation on here for anything.
They could be in default, couldn't they?
Right.
Yep. There's risk to the buyer. There's no question. There's risk to the buyer. You get a buyer says, well, okay, I've got the money, but we were going to use that to improve the property or to send my kid to college or to whatever. And you ask yourself, well, does the IRS care? Here's the money that's owed, pay it. If you don't pay it, you know, we'll come after you.
Or they're getting gift funds just to satisfy a lender.
Exactly.
They don't have it.
They don't have any more money. They can't do it. And that's a problem. It really is a risk. And in the market we're in, and will continue to be in, and it's not had nothing to do with the low inventory, we do have a lot of foreign sellers. And we'll continue to have more and more. Yes, ma'am.
What if you have a foreign buyer and they-
Doesn't matter. Foreign buyer doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter.
The entire 100% of the question with a foreign buyer is the financing. If the buyer's paying cash, nobody cares. Nobody cares.
If they only have a tenant, they don't have a
We don't care. We don't care. See, we don't care anything. The only thing the buyer needs for the title company is to be able to identify who's going to be on the title.
How does the foreign buyer buy? Is it here?
Well, first of all, they've got to have a lender who will loan money to a foreign buyer if they're going to do financing. And there are lenders out there who do it. They have certain requirements. So, yeah, we'll do it, you know, whatever. If they're paying cash, the question becomes, where's the cash now? Because most countries have limitations on how much money a person can bring out of that country.
How could this send cash? Because I have maybe foreign buyer like Canada. So he wants to invest. So how would he send money from Canada?
Well, in that case, he needs to determine from the financial institution he's got the money in Canada, what's their procedure. Now, I don't know that Canada has any significant restrictions on moving money. Many other countries do. I'm not familiar with whether it can, but he's got to have that conversation. He needs to talk to his lender, or the money where the bank is. And then if he's going to do financing, to the lender here and find out, here's what's going to be involved. Here's what we need from you to do that. And then his lender's going to say, yeah, here's how we transfer the money for you to be able to buy it. And here's our procedure. So he's going to have to talk to his bank where the money is now, for his down or his whole cash deal. And then the lender here who's going to loan him money on it, find out what their requirements are. Because the question really on buyers, foreign buyers, gets to be the financing of it all.
Before he does anything.
Yeah, it's just like before you start showing a buyer property, you find out if he's qualified for what he wants to look at. Absolutely. Yep, you bet. We've talked about the HOAs and working through that. The sixth thing here, the pros and cons of providing offer guidelines, which we kind of talked about before. If you got the listing and you want to provide offer guidelines to buyers, you need to make sure that this is because your seller's on board with this. This can't just be you. Because the offer guidelines can really impact on the marketing of the property and offers from buyers. And so make sure you have the conversation and make sure all the offer guidelines make sense. That they're good guidelines, that have a good practical basis for them, and say, yeah, here's what we want to do, and this makes good sense as you work through it. Is that semi good? Kind of good with that. And these are kind of maybe more referencing anything else. A couple of documents, repair amendment concepts and repair amendment language. We're probably in a future class, maybe the one that we'll have the second one next month. I think one of our agent hotline people are going to do a co-instruction with me. We'll probably talk more about the challenge we're having with repair amendment language. Yeah, because we tend to be a little vague. We need to be really specific, and these four concepts of making sure that it's clear and understandable and all like that, because so often it's not.
You're not even specific on what you're asking for. So
Yeah.
redo that.
Well, and it hurts both sides. It can hurt your buyer, but also hurts the seller, because the buyer says, well, here's what you've agreed to. So no, that's not what I was thinking. That's not what I saw. And it hurts both sides if it's not good and clear and specific. The reality is, and this is an agent job, the buyer and the seller both have in their heart and their mind, here's what I want to have done. When the buyer uses that terrible phrase, AC to be evaluated, serviced, or repaired as necessary. Buyer says, you know what? I want to close on a house that's got an AC that's working perfectly and may even be new. That's what I want. Well, that's not what you said. Seller said, yeah, I can get somebody cheap out here and they can look at it. Yeah, it's still running. Everything's fine. We're good. And you got a freon leak. Well, it doesn't leak all that much. The seller's concept of what the buyer just asked for typically is very different from what the buyer is, but in his heart, the buyer says, yeah, here's what I expect to have happen. Well, you need to say that. Be very specific, because when it's not specific and things happen, who does it come back on? You. Because you're the one that didn't help your client make sure it was clear, specific language. And we've got one right now that we're still going through, one of our good agents, and it's a window issue, and we're still working through it and dealing with it. And I don't know what we'll finally resolve, because he's threatening Trek and lawsuits and all that kind of stuff. And it's a buyer issue. And you know, sometimes, for example, and it talks about this, where it talks about referencing to the inspection report and things like that. One of the challenges is sometimes you'll reference to the inspection report and you'll do it in a way that implies that the way the inspector commented about a deficiency determines what the seller needs to fix, what they need to do. You can never do that. That's not what the inspector is doing. Inspector may be commenting about a deficiency, but it's not making a recommendation on what has to be done to repair it. That needs to be very specific. And yet sometimes you reference to an inspection report, reference to sections, expecting the seller to understand, yeah, all those things the inspector said, all those deficiencies, we need all those fixed. Really? What does that mean? What are you saying that needs to be done? Because it's just not. And this, we're kind of sliding back in the situation because we're so busy and dealing with all these other issues that sometimes we get into the inspection and we begin to negotiate repairs. We kind of just let things slide. And we got to really get back and work on that. Oh, great. Yeah, like see it, because you know I need a good example of really bad language. Absolutely, work through that. Now, Zoom folks, you guys have been somewhat quiet. I don't know if that means you're napping or whatever. So, you guys have any more? We dealt with a lot of stuff here. We're about to wrap up. You guys, yes, Nick.
Just final thoughts on the repair stuff. Sometimes I feel like we're repair people and not realtors.
I'm sorry, you what?
I repair people and not realtors, because all I deal with is repairs. I mean, maybe not so much now because there's so many multiple offers, so buyers are limiting what they're asking for. But like 2 years ago, like Marjorie and I mean, we're not licensed.
Rich, I'm not sure I'm clear on what your question
We
is.
deal so much more with repair issues more than we do with the actual realtor stuff.
Really? Okay, okay.
And normally, because like what you just said, well, you have to be very specific.
Yeah,
And sometimes it comes on us on how to be very.
because your buyer doesn't know.
Now, how are we supposed to know?
Okay,
And then we rely on a licensed plumber to come out
yeah.
and they'll tell us, say, well, this is what needs to be done.
So
You know, it's.
that's a great question, and here are the steps. First of all, it's going to be important for you in a very serious inquiry with your buyer to get to the heart of what they're looking for.
Yeah.
You almost want to say, tell me how this looks. You close, you've got the keys, you're going into your new house. What does it look like? What are you seeing? Regarding the AC, regarding the plumbing, regarding that leak, what's your feeling here? What needs to be there? And how do we make sure we accomplish that in going through it? The other is, and we're missing on this, when you have an AC person come out, you have a plumber come out, don't let that person be making the decision. Let them create a report. The AC person has evaluated it and has the information to provide to your buyer and say, here's what we've discovered. Here's what we need. And the biggest one that gets skipped a lot, Freon's low. Well, if it's Freon's low, there's a leak. I'm sorry, I'm not an expert on that, but that's just what it is. So somebody needs to resolve that. And we need to make sure we do, but we need that report from the AC people, because if we don't take that next step, one, to get a report from them so our buyer can make decisions, what you want to have done, the AC person makes the decision and does things. And sometimes when they're doing things, there's a seller saying, oh, no, we don't need to do that. Let's just do this. And then minimize what's taken care of. So you're exactly right. As you go through this, we don't want to be in the repair business, but we want to listen to our client. Here's what they expect. And based on that, with your great ability to express things clearly, with your great communication ability. Well, he said as president for CCAR for a year and did a great job communicating. Take those talents and use it on this. Because that's what you got to do, because you know that's the objective now.
I'm just saying, we as a whole have now turned into.
We what?
Have turned into repair people.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Now, let me make a suggestion. When you write a repair amendment, especially when it's a lot of stuff in there, show it to somebody who's not in the business and say, hey, what do you think was just said? What do you think we just asked for? And see if they can say, well, I don't have a clue. One of our good agents has asked me to review an agreement she uses on certain situations. Property owned, so she's got some ability there to do that. And it's like 20 pages. I got to the second page and said, I don't have a clue what you're talking about. I mean, you have conflicts in this paragraph, in the previous paragraph. I don't even know where you're going with this. I said, and if I don't get it, if I don't understand it, you don't have a hope with the people that you're having in this deal, do it. So we got to really, and I'm finally going to have you recommend this, you got to get a good real estate attorney to help you with this.
Is there any way like getting a receipt or warranty? So even if after the buyer buys, if it goes wrong, he can go to get the warranty. I mean,
yeah, we need to make sure warranties get coordinated, not just the home warranty, make sure that was properly done, but the warranty for the AC, warranty for the electrical, plumbing, things like that. Make sure they're understanding, make sure foundation is a big issue, that certain things need to be done in order for that foundation warranty to be transferred, and make sure those are done and make sure the buyer understands the limitations of it. And every foundation warranty has one big, huge limitation. It relies on the foundation company still being in business.
I actually think a good class to be for new agents, because I've learned a lot in the last years. We've had so many, it's some kind of inspection class so they understand what to ask for and how to.
That's a good idea. And I think Lee Warren would be a great instructor for that. I think that would be good.
I mean, I just took a really good.
Here, and it was the best class, SAE class.
Because I think.
Yes, Johnny Gordon would be very good. Yep.
We ought to do that, because I actually know Johnny a lot over.
That's a great idea. As long as we understand when we take a class like that and we learn a lot, we're not becoming inspectors,
No, but they know what's.
but they know what to expect, what to go through. So who taught that SAE class?
It was, she was actually a 30-year inspector, and it was a champions, and it was for my SAE class. And
Yeah.
It was like the best class.
You don't remember who it was?
See, I had that class, if it's the same instructor, to me, I thought she was very inaccurate on a lot of things.
Really? See? Okay, here's what I'd like for you to do. Okay. Would you find out who it is and send it to me? Send me an email or something so I can follow up. But I think that's a great idea. Johnny Gordon, Lee Warren, someone like that. Be great. Who?
Garrett Hand.
Okay.
Elite Inspection Group. Excellent.
Somebody who knows their stuff and can make a good presentation.
And again, one of the things they mentioned was that the inspector is not, he's just looking at the overall.
Sure. That's a generalist inspection.
Yeah,
Yep. Not invasive. Yep.
In that particular.
Yep.
Or whatever you recommend.
That's why many buyers are doing additional AC inspections, roof inspections, foundation plumbing inspections. They're doing that addition to the track inspection. So absolutely correct. I agree with that.
I think it would just help people understand.
I-
What to ask for, how to write it up.
Well, I think it would be good. I think it would be a really good class and maybe we can find some people and try to do it in the classes next month. That's a good idea. I like it. Yes, sir.
Many buyers are doing that additional inspection. Doesn't that weaken their position?
Okay, if a buyer's doing what?
It's true.
Doing that extra inspection, doesn't that actually weaken their position?
In what way?
today's market?
Well, but see, remember, they're already in contract. They're already in contract. They're in a contract. They're already in contract. So they can do all that stuff because they're already in contract. So they're just getting additional information to be able to negotiate with the seller who doesn't have to do anything.
Right.
But they're not doing this in preparation to try to get a contract. They already are in contract. So they're doing these additional inspections. So they have all the information they need to know whether to proceed with the property.
But that's where you as an agent fill up your pipeline of vendors, and then, I mean, I have AC guys that I would send that inspection report, that AC, what do you think? They're like, oh, yeah, just now, whatever, and then, I mean.
Yeah, I was
Those
just
are the main things.
So I don't think since we're after the fact,
earlier about, if a seller has a backup offer. then-
well, okay. Shh. Let's make a really good point and then we're through. Last good point. Remember, once the buyer and seller are in a contract, seller cannot be required to do any repairs at all, period. The only exception, and he doesn't have to in the buyer and seller contract, is paragraph 14, the casualty laws. Otherwise, not required to do anything. So if the seller's sitting there with a backup contract better than your contract, he's not gonna do anything anyway. And the buyer says, well, I'm just getting additional information, working through the process. But seller doesn't have to do anything. And sellers who say, well, remember, this is an as-is contract, I don't have to do it. Well, yeah, it's actually in the contract, it says that. So you didn't have to tell us that, we already knew it, it's paragraph 7D, so it's there. But I think after the fact, if you've got a contract, and buyer needs to understand, they're getting all this additional information, maybe they're spending additional money on the additional inspections to make sure they're good, but it doesn't mean doing all this is going to make the seller have to do anything.
Yeah.
He doesn't. But it does not give the seller any right to termination. So you say, well, you know what? I'm not gonna do anything. And by the way, you're such a pain, I'm gonna terminate the contract. Well, there's no PETA phrase in the contract. You don't get to terminate because of that.
So what's the buyer's motivation for doing that?
Having good information about condition of the property, because are they getting ready to have another class? Are we working into their other class? So.
Well, if you get a buyer in that, it's an AC.
So the reality is the buyer wants this information to know how he wants to move forward. Are you getting ready to have a class in here or something?
We haven't, our already, but you take your time.
What do you have?
Our team's doing a deal.
Well, your team should probably come in here and learn something. So in that case, they just want more information, not requiring seller to do anything, but seller get to make a decision, wants to keep on. Thank you. Thank you all for being here. Guys, thank you very, very much for being here. I appreciate it greatly. Thank you, Zoom folks. Thank you all. And see you whenever. Boy, it must be a really important team that gets this whole room. Wow.
I really like Barbara George put this out for my girl.
Okay, good. Good.
I do think that a class like that inspection class.
Oh, I agree. I think that's a good idea.
I learned last year just from being so busy.
Oh, yeah.
That's how I learned.
Good. That's right. We've gotten into the repair business and we need to not do that. It's, one, it's not good service to clients, a liability.
I'm gonna send you with that agency.